Heather, it seems to me that anyone who's ever met you sings your praises. Recently,
Oh,
Sarah Penner said you've been an incredible mentor. My friend Allison Hammer says you're one of the biggest champions of authors. So I am absolutely thrilled that I finally get to meet you in person, if we can
oh.
call that, and chat about your upcoming book.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very sweet. I am a teacher at heart. I mean, I was a high school teacher for a decade, and now I'm an adjunct at Drexel University, and I'm a freelance editor. So I'm constantly helping either published writers or aspiring writers, and I don't know. I think it fulfills that teacher need in me. So
I didn't realize that we had the teacher thing in common. We'll have to talk about that after the recording, too.
yeah, sure.
Let's start, if you wouldn't mind telling our
Yeah.
readers what the next ship home is about.
So you have a beautiful little graphic there of it in the corner, so I don't have to hold it up. The Next Ship Home. So it is a book of Ellis Island. It's set in 1902, and the backdrop is 1902. You have the subway being built, so the roads are torn up in New York City, and everybody's complaining about it. You have thousands of immigrants arriving on the shore of Ellis Island every single week, and all these people have somewhere they need to go. So you have those thousands that become millions quickly flooding into the Lower East Side, which they now call the East Village in Manhattan, because it's the cheapest place to live, and the tenements there. And then you also have the labor movement kicking up. You've got Roosevelt, who stepped in because McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. You got all this stuff going on. So I found that really a fascinating landscape. And I love New York City. I'm in Connecticut, so I'm not that far from New York. And the history there is just really so rich and varied and interesting. So I've got that as my backdrop. And then I have Francesca, who is a Sicilian immigrant who comes through Ellis Island as one protagonist. And she very quickly hopes to get through and to find a job and start her new life with her sister. Things do not go according to plan, as so often is the case in life. And the other main character is a matron who works at Ellis Island, and she does not like immigrants, and she has been raised to sort of fear them and abhor them. She's German American, first generation, and she has very much to learn, and crosses paths with Francesca, and they become unlikely friends quickly and decide if they're going to confront the corruption rippling through the halls of Ellis Island or not. And in the process, there's a big secret that happens along the way. So
As you
lots going on.
Yes, yes. And as you mentioned, this novel is inspired by true events. How did you learn about these events, and what was it in particular that inspired you to dedicate a full novel to it?
Yeah, so I knew that I wanted to explore the building of Ellis Island itself. It's like a character in the novel, and I think in real life, if you've been there, there's a real presence to
Mhm.
this place. I mean, you can feel the millions of souls that have passed through there. It still kind of lingers in the air, I feel. And so that started it. So I knew I wanted, some real life information about how the immigrants were actually processed. And then from there, I started just reading a lot of resources, of course, about what the process was. And in this book called American Passage by Vince Cannato, he's a history professor at UMass. He started detailing some of the awful things that was happening there, and I thought, oh my god, okay, so there's a lot more to this story than just land of the free, home of the brave, come to our shores. And so I started digging into that a bit, and I ended up in the New York Times archives and found between 1900 and 1903 a series of articles that talked about the corruption happening at Ellis Island. And when I hit one that was about 40 people that were hauled in before a grand jury for swindling the immigrants, for stealing, extortion, for sexual harassment, all kinds of things, I knew I had that was my story. That would be the backbone. And so that's what's happening in the background. You have Roosevelt, who's just hired a new commissioner to go clean house at Ellis Island and to find out who these people are that are, caught up in all of the corruption. And then you have my two girls women moving through this environment. So so yeah, how could you? I mean, that's so juicy and awful and also fascinating. So I got kind of hooked into that.
That is definitely not the history I learned in high school.
Yeah.
Personally, my favorite part of the writing process is researching. So I always like to ask authors what their research process is like, especially since the pandemic has changed the way that many historical fiction authors have been able to do research. So first, I want to know if you were able to travel while researching this book, and then what particular sources you found useful, besides, of course, the articles and the textbook that you just mentioned during your research process.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, the book was finished in January of 2020, and we were ready to take it to publishers. Yeah. But then we sat on it until June because of the pandemic, and it was the first wave when we were all terrified and we had no idea what was going to happen. And so we just, you're not pitching books in New York City while it's under siege, from the virus. So I was able to, almost all of my research was done way before that. You know how books are in production for at least a year. So I went out to Ellis Island a dozen times or so and took videos and did all of their tours and all their brochures and plaques and everything you can think of. So that was a huge resource too. But also I dug through a bunch of compilations of immigrant interviews, which were great. I found really different experiences from each other. Some were amazed by how much food they got at Ellis Island and the kinds of things they got because they were starving and poor. Some were completely disgusted by what was what was served there. People had never seen bananas. They had never had ice cream or white bread. They had this huge list of things. Some that had an amazing experience there and it just kind of, amazing as in very easy, and they were excited and hopeful and ready to start their new life. And then you had some that were abused and treated very poorly, either physically or through the way they were spoken to. So yeah, it was, those were really fascinating. I got a lot of little tidbits from there, but they made me cry a lot. I mean, they were very emotional. These people gave up everything they knew in their lives to come to a place where they hoped they could have a better life. And that's so big, right? It's hugely emotional. So.
Absolutely. I absolutely cannot imagine what that must have been like. What was the most interesting thing you learned from your research that you weren't able to fit into the story or it had to be cut?
Oh, there's so much. I'll narrow it down to two major things. One was that Roosevelt actually came out to Ellis Island because he kept hearing all these rumors about all the horrible things happening and was trying to decide if he was going to have another inspection done of all of the staff and all of the protocol and all of the routines and such, or not. And so the day he was coming out there, they planned this big lunch, this, fancy with champagne and oysters, etc. But it was a really, really stormy day. And if you've ever been to that part of Manhattan, where the Hudson meets the East River is actually pretty tumultuous. And so with this crazy storm, his boat almost sunk. They had to keep going back to shore, and it took him 2.5 hours or something to get to Ellis Island, and it's only a 15-minute ferry ride. So if that tells you anything. So it was very hard to get out there. He finally did, and lunch was cold naturally, but I really wanted to put that in because I thought, Roosevelt, everybody wants to know more about Roosevelt. It's a big name, and I wanted to show him having this danger, but arriving there and just like an immigrant would and all this stuff. But it was a year later than the book, than that, that the backbone that I was talking about was set, and I just could not figure out a way to fit it in. So.
Sorry, can you hear that?
I did, but it was very faint.
I'm going to let him go by before we continue. I'll cut this out. But someone just delivered, it looks like a refrigerator. I'm not sure what
Oh
kind
my goodness. Well, you have that and I have boxes in the background, so we're even.
It's like the front door to my building is like right next to my office, so I hear
is it?
everything come in and out. Okay, I think we might be over. Sorry about that.
No worries. It's all good. Listen, I have kids. And I sent them on an errand while we were doing this. And any moment they're going to come crashing through the front door. And I hope they don't come up here. That looks better. Okay. I had this closed because it seemed too bright, but maybe that's a little bit better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me check. Okay, let's try and keep going. We'll see how that goes.
Sure.
Okay, this is your 4th solo novel, plus you've written 3 novels with Hazel Gaynor, and you've contributed to 3 anthologies, if I counted correctly.
Yes. Yes.
What have you learned between writing and publishing your debut novel and now? And what advice do you have for aspiring authors?
That's a huge question, because what haven't I learned is really the answer. I've learned so much about writing books in terms of craft, and so much about the business of publishing. And they don't work very well together often, but they have to. So we figure it out. So that's one of the things I've learned, but many, many other things. So what I would tell an aspiring writer in particular would be to finish your first draft. Stop editing and re-editing and writing beautiful sentences and cutting. Get the first draft down. You're going to make it pretty and do layer after layer after layer for many months after that. But if you don't have a first draft, you've got nowhere to go with it. And you're not going to really know what the story is until you get the full thing down on paper. So I always say, get your first draft down. I'm trying to think what else. God, there's so many things, but I think that's one of the most important, because it's very easy to just stop and to keep editing, and then you never really get anywhere. You're shaking your head like you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so hard to get that first draft written. You just want your first chapter to be the best first chapter it can ever be. So moving on and actually finishing the story, it was some of the earliest advice I got too, and it was the best. Otherwise, I would still be writing my first chapter, which would probably not even be my first chapter.
Well, that's the thing, is that you discover after you've written a whole first draft that you may not have even started the book in the right place.
Right.
You can't know that until you've written the whole book. So there you go.
And of course, as you mentioned, in addition to writing novels, you also offer editing and consulting services. Yeah. So tell us a bit about those services. What can authors expect when working with you?
Well, so I for consultations, I've talked to people who are multi-published and they're changing directions, or they have questions about, marketing, etc. But I've talked, the entire range, people who are just starting out, who just have basic questions about, okay, what do I do after I've written the book? What's next? And I sort of walk them through some of that stuff. I work on query letters and synopses. I do chunks of pages, or I do full novels with a deep developmental edit, with a big editorial letter and inline comments. My goal is to be as positive and upbeat as possible, but to be honest, because I don't think you're serving anyone. You're not helping anyone by being too nice, and so I think it's a real fine balance of optimism and you can do this sort of motivation, and this is what needs to be fixed. Here's the real deal. This is what I see happening, and this is what I would recommend, kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes I have to help them kind of break it down and figure out how to apply that kind of feedback. But that tends to be more sort of on the aspiring end than some of the other clients I get. So, even as a multi-published author at this point myself, I have beta readers I have critique partners and I work in stages with them, and I usually have at least 4 reads. So, I mean, and they give me pages and pages of notes. I mean, we all need this. So you can't see everything yourself. It's too hard. There's too much going on if you want your book to be, layered and interesting and compelling. You're going to want those reads. So
yeah, and I found that when I re-edit so many times, I kind of forget what's in there and what I took out. So having an additional set of eyes, not
absolutely,
the background of it helps.
Yeah, no, it's true. You get to especially when you're starting out, you kind of forget. You've done so much on it already that you kind of forget where you're at, I think. And I think of editing as like this giant octopus with all these arms, and you have to figure out how to tame it. And there is a way to do that. There is a way to be very systematic in the way that you work through your edits. So that's actually something I talk about a lot at conferences too.
Well, I was going to ask how you got into this, but now that I know you have this teaching background, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, I taught French. I didn't teach English or history, amazingly, but the principle's the same. I mean, it's still language learning and all that good stuff. So,
well, in my experience, authors always have the best book recommendations. So I want you to tell us a bit about your reading world. What do you like to read? What would you recommend that we read right now?
So I'm reading all the time. I find that the best way that I have grown as an author, besides feedback from my partners, is through reading other people's amazing books and just learning about structure and all these things as I'm reading. And so, yes, I'm reading all the time, and I read very widely. So, I mean, you'll see me reading some murdery suspense book, and then I will follow it with a rom-com, and then I will be reading some historical or some sort of mythology based fantasy, or I'm kind of all over the place. I love YA, so contemporary and fantasy and paranormal. I like this huge range. So I kind of go in phases where I get kind of obsessed with one kind of topic and I read it for a while, and then I get saturated and I move on to the next thing. So I just finished a book right now. I'm obsessed with con artists. I don't know why. I'm blaming Inventing Anna on Netflix. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, loved that show.
And then there's like the Tender. I don't know
what Swindler.
The Tender Swindler. And then there's the cake or the vegan one.
Bad Vegan.
Bad Vegan.
I know, I've seen them all.
And that's so funny. And so Julie Clark, she's a suspense writer, and her novel, The Last Flight, came out, I think 2 years ago. And it was fantastic. It hit the New York Times list. So her follow-up is The Lies I Tell, and it's about a con artist. And I got an early copy, so I read it very quickly and loved it. So that's a great book. And her first book is a great book too. And then I am currently reading Mary Jane. And that was, I want to say it was one of those book club picks. I'm pulling it up on my phone because I do a lot of audiobooks. And it's Jessica Anya Blau. So this has been, and there's another cover for it where there's like a multicolored record player. You may have seen in hardcover.
Yeah,
it was a really popular, and people just kept talking about how it's a fun book. It's a young girl who has very straight and narrow parents in the 60s, and she ends up being a babysitter for these hippies. And it totally opens up her whole world. So you get all that lovely like 60s and 70s kind of pop culture stuff mixed in. And it's been a fun read so far. So
that's so fun. I definitely agree with your obsession with the con artist stories. I think there's new like cult stories. There used to be all about the cults that were taking place in history. And now I feel like it's the con artist wave.
The con artists too, and I love. I'm really interested in white collar crime, like stealing art and artifacts and jewelry and these kinds of things.
Another good one is the WeWork docu series called We Crashed.
I need to look at that.
Yeah, that should be the next one.
Yeah, I'll check it out for sure.
And I always like to hear, and I have to ask, what our favorite authors are working on. So can you tell us anything about your work in progress?
I can. So I haven't actually been given the green light to officially announce it online, but when I'm doing an event or I'm chatting with somebody, I'm done hiding it. I'm done hiding it because we have a due date and we have a title, and so it's coming out in January, and it's called Strangers in the Night, and it is a novel of Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner.
Ooh.
So yeah, they had a very tumultuous, tragic love affair that lasted their whole lives after they met. And they were absolutely nuts. I mean, the two of them were nuts. They were nuts together, they were nuts apart, and they were fabulously talented, both of them. And just really, really fascinating people. So my publisher actually asked me to write this book. And so I said, sure, it's Frank Sinatra. Who says no to Frank Sinatra?
Oh, I am such a big Frank Sinatra fan.
Oh.
I'm actually doing an Instagram series right now on Reels. Like Frank Sinatra sings about books and my love of books.
Oh, how funny.
So funny. Oh, I cannot wait to read this. Thank you so much for sharing. Now I have something to look forward to in the next year.
Yay. And it's very different from The Next Ship Home. You know, it's a tragic love story that's a dual biographical. So it's a different setup, but you know, you don't turn your publisher away when it's a great idea. So
I'm trying to remember, have you written about real characters before? Like,
I have. So my first book was Becoming Josephine, about Josephine Bonaparte.
yes.
And my second was Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin. I did both of their points of view, and they also had a very tragic, passionate love affair. And they were these famous sculptors in 19th century France. And so I do like to write biographicals on occasion. I actually prefer books more like The Next Ship Home creatively, because you just create the characters and the story almost from the ground up. And I find that really satisfying and fun. But the other, you know, biographicals are fun in a different way. You feel like you get to know them as if they were your friends, you know, because they were real, and you feel like you can almost talk to them, and it's a really interesting, cool feeling. So
no, I couldn't agree more. I am writing a biographical novel as well. And I'm finding that it's difficult, this dichotomy between wanting to write fiction primarily, but also sticking true to facts and what actually happened in their lives. It's a fine balance, I think, that I would like to explore, not writing about real people, to see what that is like.
Yeah, it's tricky. The thing with real people too is that they're not always nice or likable, and sometimes they're not sympathetic even. And so you have to find ways to, within the sort of arc of their lives, their lifetime, find the piece of their lifetime that you want to, where the story is that you want to tell. And then you have to figure out ways to reveal who they are in a way that would be appealing to a reader. And that's tricky.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, with Ava and Frank, you know, there are a lot of things that the two of them did that were absolutely abhorrent to each other, never mind to other people. And, you know, but they were human beings and they made mistakes. And so I find humanity in that personally, but it'll be interesting to see how the readers take it, for sure.
Curious, do you like them more or less after writing this book?
Oh, I love them both. I love them. Yeah. I mean, initially I was like, what is going on? When I was reading the research, like, what is she doing? What is he doing? But I have an affinity for them. I was just in Palm Springs in February. I'd never been there. And I went out there to visit Frank's grave and take pictures. And I went to where his house was out there in the desert, which is now this unbelievably gorgeous gated community of millionaires. But his grave was this quiet little tomb where there was no big headstone or anything, and there were a bunch of flowers and some Jack Daniels left for him. And and there were people there that were doing the same thing I was doing, so that was kind of interesting.
I have been to Palm Springs, but I've always associated Palm Springs with Elvis. I didn't know that Frank Sinatra was buried there.
Yeah, he lived there. He had a house there for many, many years, starting in like 1951 or something like that. So
Well, now I need to go back.
You
After
do.
I read your book.
Yeah, you definitely do. So yeah.
Well, I want to share how people can find you. Can you tell us where you hang out on social media?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, although I think that's kind of more of a writer's hangout than it is a reader's hangout. But I have a Facebook page, a public page, and I'm also in a lot of reading groups on Facebook, chatting with readers, which is fun. And of course, I'm on Instagram, and all of these are at Ms. Heather Webb. They're all the same across the board, so I'm easy to find. And then, there's my website with any editing information and my contact info. So